Okay, welcome back to the Fragmented Live poetry stream. Today I want to talk about a way of categorizing poetry and some Anglo-Saxon examples of the main divisions of poetry. The categories I'm discussing here come from Aristotle, and while there are other ways to divide poetry, these remain in use today and often control how literature departments and English classes present poetry to students and what they present. Aristotle categorizes poetry in three ways according to how the poet presents himself. In the first way, in dramatic poetry, the poet does not present himself at all, but speaks through characters. There isn't what we might call a narrator or a narrative voice. So Hamlet and Polonius and Gertrude and all the others, they're the ones who do the speaking in Hamlet, not Shakespeare himself. And while there might be a character or characters that we identify with the poet in some dramatic poems, it's something that has to be determined from the text and in a way assumed. The Anglo-Saxons do not leave us examples of dramatic poetry, as this is a form for a somewhat more settled people. Dramatic poetry originally was something performed, and thus it requires a society in which stages can be constructed, actors provided, setting and costumes and such made. And these are not really things that exist in early Anglo-Saxon society. We have to wait for the Middle English period, which comes after the Norman invasion of 1066, to find real dramatic poetry. It's in the second category, which is called lyric poetry, where we do find examples. And in lyric poetry, the whole poem is, as it were, a presentation in the poet's voice. The poet speaks entirely or predominantly in his own voice. Now, poets sometimes play with this, and the lyric poem is not really the poet, but a character the poet is assuming in many poems. Still, it's largely a presentation of a single person. Lyric poems can be very short, such as a haiku, but they can also go on for hundreds of lines, but they are usually much shorter than dramatic poems or poems of the third type. The Anglo-Saxons leave many examples of lyric poetry. In the last stream, we looked at one called Cædmon's Hymn, and today I'm going to look at a poem called The Seafarer. Now, in the third type of poem, the poet speaks both in his own voice and in the voice of characters. Think of a novel in which there's a narrator who tells the story and comments on the story, but in which also there are characters who speak in dialogue with each other. The nature of this type of poem is such that it can be scaled up to the greatest length. Think of something like the Iliad or even a novel by Dostoevsky as compared with a play like Macbeth or a lyric like Cædmon's Hymn. When such poems are scaled up, this type of poem becomes what we call the epic poem. So that's the traditional division of poetry: dramatic poetry, lyric poetry, epic poetry, since the epic is the grandest version of the third type. Traditionally, that epic poem had pride of place because it was believed that it required and demonstrated the greatest poetic skill to conceive and put together a poem on this kind of scale. And the Anglo-Saxons do leave us an example of epic poetry in the form of the poem we know as Beowulf. Let's take a look at this now. So try to share my screen here, which has a translation of the poem. There we go. All right. Just a few notes about this. One of the difficulties in approaching Beowulf, if you haven't read it before, if you're not familiar with it, is that this poem is going to present you with a list of people that you've never heard of, right? Even if you haven't read the Iliad, you might have heard of Achilles and Hector and Zeus and Helen. You might have heard of these people before, but when it comes to Beowulf, you've probably never heard of Shield Shifting before, right? Who are these people? Who is the half Dane, right? So there's a bunch of characters that you're not familiar with, and places that you've never heard of. One of the things that's interesting about the poem, by the way, the poem only survives in one manuscript. So it's just by luck that we even have it at all. And the manuscript's not perfect. It has some damage. So some parts of the poem are lost, but we have most of it. And it's a poem that was written in England or composed in England, but it's set in Scandinavia. The hero Beowulf actually comes from Sweden, and he crosses the sea to the land of the Danes to clear out monsters. So it's set there, which for the Anglo-Saxons in England, they would have thought of as somewhat close to or identified with their ancestral land. So it's kind of almost like a fairy tale about a distant past, even for them. So even in 800 AD, it's already a poem that's about a very, very old time. But it's an era of a heroic honor code where you attain a name for prowess in battle, and that's the chief concern of men of merit. Now, one reason why Beowulf has become kind of an important poem in the English canon is actually due to the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien wrote an essay a long time ago called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And in that essay, he makes the case that this work is not just of philological interest, but is actually of artistic interest, because in his telling of it, it represents the work of a Christian poet who was working with traditional inherited material, some of which is magical or fabulous, some of which is historical, but it comes from what is to the poet a pagan past. And basically, what this poet is doing is he is molding this pagan past into a coherent Christian narrative, and that this represents an artistic effort, basically, that deserves to be considered as a work of art rather than just a work of merely historical interest or merely linguistic interest. In his telling, it makes a coherent whole. And I agree. And actually, I'm not the only one. That has become basically the more or less the predominant take on Beowulf, that it is kind of, or that it does kind of deserve to be taken seriously as an artistic work. I hope everyone can see here on the screen the poem here. So I've got this facing translation here so that we can look back at some of the original language here. And let's just sort of look at some elements of the poem just to see what's in there that might be of interest to us. What's in there that might show us something about the Anglo-Saxons, about poetry itself. First of all, the way it starts, what we gardena in jardeum, theod kuninge thrim gefrunen, hu the ethelingus ellen fremedon. What is the word what. And it didn't just mean what at the time, but it also had this meaning of listen up or attend, hark, if you will. And here translated, so, and Gardena, the Speardanes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. And he starts off with one, Shield Sheffing, who is translated as Shield, Chief's son. Now, what's interesting about this is the poet is describing the creation of society out of basically lawlessness, okay? The establishment of order. So there was Shield Chiefson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the whale road is the ocean, had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king, or as it is here, that was good king. What was a good king? Why was he a good king? Well, it wasn't just that he wrecked mead benches, but he established an order, right? He established an order there. And he came from nothing, a foundling to start with, That's another way of saying that he's not of noble birth, like he's just, a child that was discovered. Um, and there's a way in which that's kind of how order comes, especially to a somewhat or semi-barbaric people, right? Kind of comes out of nowhere. And then so he establishes the order, and then it starts to build. Afterwards, a boy child was born to shield, a cub in the yard, a comfort sent by God to that nation. He knew what they had made, the long times and troubles they'd come through without a leader. So the Lord of life, the glorious Almighty, made this man renowned, shielded fathered a famous son. Now, here, this is the Seamus Heaney translation. Heaney translates it as Baal, but if you look, this guy's name is also Beowulf, but it's not the Beowulf who's the titular hero of this poem. That's another Beowulf. So he translates it as Baal just to avoid that confusion. Beow's name was known through the north, and a young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely while his father lives, so that afterwards in age, when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand by him and hold the line. Behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. Now, this is another interesting feature of Anglo-Saxon culture and their mindset, which is that a good leader is not just a great warrior, but a great giver. Generosity is a key feature that the Anglo-Saxons look towards, and this one is mentioned many times in this poem. The idea of giving, in fact, the phrase ring giver appears many times. And it's just the idea of you amass wealth not for yourself, but also for your people. You distribute it to your people. That is part of how you are legitimized as a ruler, is through the distribution of wealth. And yeah, okay, maybe you take that wealth from your enemies. Fair enough. But the distributing of it is important. And then this next passage is fascinating because what it demonstrates is it shows basically a Viking funeral, and it's a kind of a Christian take on a Viking funeral. And at the very end of this little passage I'm going to read, you get a sense of another key feature of poetry in general, but also the Anglo-Saxon thought, which is the mystery and seriousness of death. So let's take a look. Shield was still thriving when his time came, and he crossed over into the Lord's keeping. His warrior band did what he bade them when he laid down the law among the Danes. They shouldered him out to the sea's flood, the chief they revered who had long ruled them. A ring-whirled prow rode in the harbor, ice-clad, outbound, a craft for a prince. They stretched their beloved lord in his boat, laid out by the mast, amidships, the great ring-giver. Far-fetched treasures were piled upon him, and precious gear. I never heard before of a ship so well furbished with battle tackle, bladed weapons, and coats of mail. The massed treasure was loaded on top of him. It would travel far out into the ocean's sway. They decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did who cast him away when he was a child and launched him out alone over the waves. And they set a gold standard up high above his head and let him drift to wind and tide, bewailing him and mourning their loss. No man can tell. No wise man in hall or weathered veteran knows for certain who salvaged that load, right? What became of that boat? No one really knows for certain. There's a kind of a mystery attending this. And notice how the poet, although clearly a Christian, he's already sort of kind of made that known, but he gives great respect to this ancient rite, even though it's not a rite he necessarily believes in. That is part of the working in of traditional materials into a new religious mindset. And you're going to see that throughout the poem. That's part of the reason why the poem is important, because of the integration of different threads, if you will, different cultural threads, the integration of those into a coherent whole. That's very important. And you see it throughout. So then it fell to Remember, that's Beowulf, but not our hero of the poem, to keep the forts. He was well regarded and ruled the Danes for a long time after his father took leave of his life on earth. And then his heir, and his heir is going to be Hrothgar, the great half Dane, held sway for as long as he lived, their elder and warlord. He was 4 times a father, this fighter prince. One by one, they entered the world. Hrothgar dies, as Hrothgar says later in the poem. The good Halga and a daughter, I have heard, who was Onella's queen. Okay, so the fortunes of war favored Hrothgar. Hrothgar is a name that you know now as the name Roger. It becomes that. Friends and kinsmen flocked to his rank, young followers, a force that grew to be a mighty army. So his mind turned to hall building. Now, this is great. So, this is another great depiction of the building up of society and what that pattern is. So, this is a pattern that you see again and again. If you think of the Bible, in the Bible, David is beloved by God, but it's Solomon who builds the temple. And why? Because David, throughout his long life, is just beset by enemies on all sides. But when Solomon becomes king, he's at peace. And once peace is established, then you can build great halls. Basically, that's what humans do. First, they establish order and security, secure borders, and then they build up within. And that's what this guy does. So basically, that's what the poet is describing here is a society has been established, security has been established, and now they're going to try to build something up. So his mind turned to hall building. He handed down orders for men to work on a great mead hall, meant to be a wonder of the world forever. It would be his throne room, and there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old, but not the common land or people's lives. Now, that's interesting as well. So there's an exception there. He doesn't seem to have the power of life and death over the people. These are not absolute monarchs. There is a kind of, it's not quite equality because the Anglo-Saxons are certainly a hierarchical society, but it is not, the rulership of these kings is not absolute. They're not ruling over abject slaves, basically. They're ruling over free peoples, and that's a very different thing. So the fact that he makes exceptions, that the king doesn't have the power to distribute common land or life and death, I think that's an interesting note. We're learning a little bit about the culture here. Far and wide through the world, I have heard, orders for work to adorn that wallstead were sent to many peoples, and soon it stood there, finished and ready, in full view, the hall of halls. Herod was the name. He had settled on it, whose utterance was law. Nor did he renege, but doled out rings and torques at the table. The hall towered, its gables wide and high, and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come. The killer instinct, unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. Okay, so what happens? Well, the natural thing that happens is you build something great, but that awakens envy in others. That awakens the idea that others might want to come and take what you have, and destroy what you have. And that is what Grendel is. So Grendel is the demon. I'll skip on down a little bit. Although it does say a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the heart being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth, and so on. So hearing these happy people, he hates it. And times were pleasant for the people there until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marches, marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan. So Grendel is identified with the descendants of Cain, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. Okay. So after nightfall, Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the Ringdanes were settling into it after their drink. And there he came upon them, a company of the best, asleep from their feasting, insensible to pain and human sorrow. Suddenly then the god-cursed brute was creating havoc, greedy and grim. He grabbed, excuse me, he grabbed 30 men from their resting places and rushed to his lair, flushed up and inflamed from the raid, blundering back with the butchered corpses. Okay, so what Grendel is going to do is he just starts slaughtering people, and they can't do anything about it. For 12 years, this goes just on and on. He's taking people night after night. He ruled in defiance of right. And they don't know what to do. Um, uh, and he makes, let's go down here. So they sung about already, he's suffering. People sing about the suffering of this guy. No counselor could ever expect fair reparation from these rabid hands. All were endangered. Young and old were hunted down by that dark death shadow who lurked and swooped in the long nights on the misty moors. Nobody knows where these reavers from hell roam on their errands. Okay, so he sort of takes over this place, and so they turn to their basically their heathen beliefs. And notice how this is described by the poet. These were hard times, heartbreaking for the prince of the Shieldings. Powerful counselors, the highest in the land, would lend advice, plotting how best the bold defenders might resist and beat off sudden attacks. Sometimes at pagan shrines, they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts, they remembered hell, the almighty judge of good deeds and bad, the Lord God, head of the heavens, and high king of the world, was unknown to them. Cursed is he who in times of trouble has to thrust his soul into the fire's embrace, forfeiting help. He has nowhere to turn. But blessed is he who after death can approach the Lord and find friendship in the Father's embrace. So this is interesting. Like the poet, even though he's sort of saying, well, they're pagans, they're heathens, he pities them because they have no real option, right? They have no one to turn to. And and that pity, I think, is important because it is his own ancestors that he's talking about here. And he's not simply dismissing them or hating them. And what happens is that Beowulf, and this time it is Beowulf, the hero of the poem, he hears about this and he decides he's going to come and, excuse me, hang on a second. Let's get some water here. Make it a little bit easier on the voice. I'm not a professional, as you know, so I don't prepare these things in advance very well. Uh, uh, Having water by my side. All right. So what happens is our hero hears about this and he comes to the aid. And let's take a look for a moment at his arrival because what's interesting about the arrival and how it's described is that even here we're getting a sense of a fairly high trust society. Now, what are the signs of this? Well, let's take a look. So these men come in. They're described as armed and in armor, male, and a watchman, one of the Shielding's watchmen, sees them. So when the watchman on the wall, the Shielding's lookout, whose job it was to guard the sea cliffs, saw shields glittering on the gangplank and battle equipment being unloaded, he had to find out who and what the arrivals were. So he rode to the shore, this horseman of Hrothgar's, and challenged them in formal terms, flourishing his spear. Okay, so now remember, in an epic, all of this up till here has been narrative, and now we're going to see some dialogue. So this character will speak. What kind of men are you who arrive rigged out for combat in coats of mail, sailing here over the sea lanes in your steep-hulled boat? I have been stationed as lookout on this coast for a long time. My job is to watch the waves for raiders, any danger to the Danish shore. Never before has a force under arms disembarked so openly. Remember, Shield Chiefson established an order here, and he made the people along the coasts submit to him. So they, as far as this guy knows, no one has come invading. Not bothering to ask if the sentries allowed them safe passage or the clan had consented. nor have I seen a mightier man at arms on this earth than the one standing here. So he compliments the people. Unless I am mistaken, he is truly noble. This is no mere hanger on in a hero's armor. So now, before you fare inland as interlopers, I have to be informed about who you are and where you hail from. Outsiders from across the water, I say it again, the sooner you tell me where you come from and why, the better. The leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. If you watched the previous stream, that was how the Widsith poem began. Widsith spoke, his word hoard unlocked. So same thing here, same phrasing, exactly. He unlocked his word hoard. And here's his answer. We belong by birth to the Geat people and owe allegiance to Lord Higelac. In his day, my father was a famous man. And basically, he says who he is and where he's come from. And he's come to help help them out with their Grendel problem. And the Coast Guard answers. And I think in an interesting way, worth noting. Anyone with gumption and a sharp mind will take the measure of two things: what's said and what's done. And if you look at the Anglo-Saxon, it's actually even more blunt and clear than this. Those who know will take note of two things: words and works. Worda on worka. Words and works, words and deeds, if you will. That's what matters. And he says, well, I believe what you have told me, that you are a troop loyal to our king. Okay, so come ahead with your arms and your gear, and I will guide you. Now, I think that's pretty high trust, right? Just on this guy's word, he seems noble. They are armed, and he's going to let them come with him to his king's house just on his word. That's interesting. What's more, I'll order my own comrades on their word of honor to watch your boat down there on the strand, keep her safe in her fresh tar until the time comes for her curved prow to preen on the waves and bear this hero back to Geatland. May one so valiant and venturesome come unharmed through the clash of battle. So, hey, and we'll watch your boat. Okay, again, a little high trust, right? These strangers coming armed. He's like, okay, we believe you. I'll come with me. We'll take care of your ship. Don't worry about it. And it's very civilized, isn't it? Very civilized. So they went on their way. Okay, so and he describes describes it, uh, and he gives a wonderful description of it. They marched in step, hurrying on till the timbered hall rose before them, radiant with gold. Nobody on earth knew of another building like it. Majesty lodged there; its light shone over many lands. So their gallant escort guided them to that dazzling stronghold, and indicated the shortest way to it. Then the noble warrior wheeled on his horse and spoke these words: It is time for me to go. May the Almighty Father keep you, and in his kindness watch over your exploits. I'm away to the sea, back on alert against enemy raiders. Okay. Uh, whom this speaker means by the Almighty Father, the poet leaves kind of ambiguous. So they march on, and their question when they enter the mead hall. A proud warrior questioned the men concerning their origins. Where do you come from? Carrying these decorated shields and shirts of mail, these cheek-hinged helmets and javelins. And by the way, if you go online, you can actually see examples of exactly the kind of ringed mail and cheek-hinged uh, helmets and javelins. You can see examples of what those would have looked like. I am Hrothgar's herald and officer. I have never seen so impressive or large an assembly of strangers. Stoutness of heart, bravery, not banishment, must have brought you to Hrothgar. So he believes they look noble enough that he doesn't think these are exiles, banished men, but men who are stout of heart. Okay. Um, and then Beowulf, who hasn't been named yet, he's the speaker. Now he names himself. Beowulf is my name. Your lord and master, the most renowned son of Halfdane, will hear me out and graciously allow me to greet him in person. I'm ready and willing to report my errand. And he does that. And they do come in. They're not allowed to bring their weapons. Hrothgar has heard of Beowulf. He knows who he is. And they are allowed to come in. Shields must stay here and spears be stacked until the outcome of the audience is clear. Okay, so that's all fine. And then Beowulf comes in and says, I'm going to come. And he basically says, he gives his resume, if you will, and says, now I mean to be a match for Grendel, settle the outcome in single combat. And basically he says, here's my request. You let me take this guy on and see what happens. Whichever one death fells must deem it a just judgment by God. If Grendel wins, it will be a gruesome day. He will glut himself in the gates in the war hall, swoop without fear on that flower of manhood as on others before. Then my face won't be there to be covered in death. He will carry me away as he goes to ground, gorged and bloodied. He will run gloating with my raw corpse and feed on it alone in a cruel frenzy, fouling his moor nest. No need then to lament for long or lay out my body. If the battle takes me, send back this breast webbing that Wayland fashioned and Hrethel gave me to Lord Higelac. Fate goes ever as fate must. Now, fate, I think it's worth noting here, is the word weird, from which we get the word weird now. But weird in Anglo-Saxon times had a much broader and more significant meaning. And yes, it did mean something like fate, the way things must be or will work out. And that word repeats again and again in this poem. Fate or weird, one's weird, carrying one on. So there's also this deep sense of fate in Anglo-Saxon culture that you'll see. And I think it's fascinating that the hero basically says, hey, let me take him on, and it's no loss to you. If I die, I die. You don't even have to worry about burying me. But if he wins, then obviously, then they're rid of a very dangerous foe. So that's kind of like a win-win for them or it's a no-lose situation for them. Either the guy wins and the problems are solved, or it doesn't. And of course, they agree to all this, and they have a great feast to sort of celebrate the deal being made. And there's a very interesting thing that happens during this feast, where some trash talking happens. And there's this character named Unferth speaks up. From where he crouched at the king's feet, Unferth, a son of Eglaf, spoke contrary words. Beowulf's coming, his sea braving, made him sick with envy. He could not brook or abide the fact that anyone else alive under heaven might enjoy greater regard than he did. Are you the Beowulf who took on Breca in a swimming match on the open sea, risking the water just to prove that you could win? It was sheer vanity made you venture out on the main deep, and no matter who tried, friend or foe, to deflect the pair of you, neither would back down. The sea test obsessed you. You waded in, embracing water, taking its measure, mastering currents, riding on the swell. The ocean swayed, winter went wild in the waves, but you vied for 7 nights, and then he outswam you, came ashore as the stronger contender. He was cast up safe and sound one morning among the Hetherans, then made his way to where he belonged in Bronding country. Home again, sure of his ground and strong room and brawn. So Breca made good his boast upon you and was proved right. No matter, therefore, how you may have fared in every bout and battle till now. This time you'll be worsted. No one has ever outlasted an entire night against Grendel. Now, this is great. So he talks some trash. And, the Anglo-Saxons are quite simply, well, they're not, a bunch of hood thugs. So Beowulf doesn't like chop this guy's head off. What he does is he has a gracious response. He basically says, you're just drunk. Beowulf, Ecgtheow's son, replied, well, friend Unferth, you've had your say about Breca and me, but it was mostly beer that was doing the talking. The truth is this. And then he basically says, nah, that's not how it worked. It was fine. I won. He didn't win. And then he trashes him at the end. Now, I cannot recall any fight you entered, Unferth, that bears comparison. I don't boast when I say that neither you nor Breca were ever much celebrated for swordsmanship or for facing danger on the field of battle. You killed your own kith and kin. So for all your cleverness and quick tongue, you will suffer damnation in the depths of hell. The fact is, Unferth, if you were truly as keen or courageous as you claim to be, Grendel would never have got away with such unchecked atrocity, attacks on your king, havoc in Heorot, and horrors everywhere. But he knows he need never be in dread of your blade making a missile of his blood, or of vengeance arising ever from this quarter, from the victory shieldings, the shoulders of the spear. He knows he can trample down you Danes to his heart's content, humiliate and murder without fear of reprisal. But he will find me different. I will show him Malgeat's shape to kill in the heat of battle. Then whoever wants to may go bravely to mead when morning light, scarfed and sun dazzled, shines forth from the south and brings another daybreak to the world. So he's like, yeah, I'll take care of it, not you. Um, and basically, the response is great. Basically, the laughter started. This mockery is enjoyed, and the din got louder, and the crowd was happy. Um, okay. So now Beowulf, they bring in some drinks. They drink the health of Hrothgar and others, and then Beowulf makes what we call a formal boast. I had a fixed purpose when I put to sea. As I sat in the boat with my band of men, I meant to perform to the uttermost what your people wanted, or perish in the attempt in the fiend's clutches. And I shall fulfill that purpose, prove myself with a proud deed, or meet my death here in the mead hall. And it's called a formal boast, which pleases the lady and everybody else. A formal boast is a big deal. Now, among the Anglo-Saxons, boasting in and of itself is not a good thing. However, a boast that you can make good is noble. And I think there's an important distinction here, and it's kind of an interesting one. Uh, Basically, the mentality is the mentality expressed by Muhammad Ali when he said, "It ain't bragging if it's the truth." And if you want to think of another kind of more modern example, when Joe Namath promised that the Jets were going to win the Super Bowl, and they did, that would be considered a formal boast made good in Anglo-Saxon terms. And you could make the argument that that's the reason why he's in the Hall of Fame, despite having terrible numbers as a quarterback, or let's say indifferent numbers as a quarterback. But he did a great deed. He did a heroic deed, at least according to old Anglo-Saxon terms. You make a boast, you make the boast good. So, what he does, Beowulf says he's not going to, Grendel doesn't use weapons. So I'm not going to use weapons either. And as it turns out, that's fine because Grendel is immune to weaponry, like no blade can cut him. But he's just going to rely on his own strength. Um, um, no weapons, therefore, for either this night. Unarmed he shall face me, if face me he dares. May the divine Lord in his wisdom grant the glory of victory to whichever side he sees fit. This is one of the ways in which the poet sort of works in his kind of Christian understanding. He has these characters say these things, which it's kind of ambiguous what divine Lord they mean. Now, the poet probably has one in mind, but and it seems to be the Christian one, but they don't know, as he's already told us in the poem, they don't know that one. But he still has them talk this way, still has them speak in this fashion. That's kind of one of the ways he weaves together the traditional tale and the new revelation. All right, so the way Beowulf defeats Grendel is he tears his arm off, basically. Well, actually, the creature tears his own arm off. The creature comes in and he grabs hold of him. Um, and it's described the captain of evil discovered himself in a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the earth. Every bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. Then Higelac's trusty retainer, Higelac is that, in other words, Beowulf, recalled his bedtime speech, sprang to his feet and got a firm hold. Fingers were bursting, the monster backtracking, the man overpowering. The dread of the land was desperate to escape, to take a roundabout road and flee. And so he, and I like the description of how he cries out. Then an extraordinary wail arose. A bewildering roar came over the Danes. Everyone felt it. Who heard that cry as it echoed off the wall, a god-cursed scream and strain of catastrophe, the howl of the loser, the lament of the hell serf keening his wound. He was overwhelmed, manacled tight by the man who, of all men, was foremost and strongest in the days of this life. Okay, so yeah, and here's where it's uh, when they joined the struggle, there was something they could not have known at the time, that no blade on earth, no blacksmith's art could ever damage their demon opponent. He had conjured the harm from the cutting edge of every weapon, but his going away out of this world in the days of this life would be agony to him, and his alien spirit would travel far into fiend's keeping. Uh, and let's look at how it's described. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulder. Sinews split and the bone lappings burst. This kind of concrete description of things is that's at the heart of English poetry then and now. This ability to describe these kind of things in great, almost, uh, yeah, almost concrete detail. Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. His days were numbered. The end of his life was coming over him. Okay, so that's eventually how Grendel comes to an end. And they celebrate this. This is the first of three villains that Beowulf overcomes in the poem. The next is Grendel's mother. Um, she comes and starts killing people in revenge, and he has to go after her next. And that's an interesting description too. Let's skip down to that. We're not going to obviously not going to go through the whole poem. I just want to pull out some uh, main details of the poem. Notice that there's a poem within a poem here. It's actually quite this is actually quite a complex work in many ways. The poem was over. The poet had performed. Um, uh, yes. I want to skip down to the Grendel's mother. They went to sleep, and one paid dearly for his night's ease, as had happened to them often ever since Grendel occupied the Gold Hall, committing evil until the end came, death after his crimes. Grendel's mother, monstrous hell bride, brooded on her wrongs. She had been forced down into fearful waters, the cold depths, after Cain had killed his father's son, felled his own brother with a sword. Branded an outlaw, marked by having murdered, he moved into the wilds. And from Cain there sprang misbegotten spirits, among them Grendel. So Grendel and his mother, these are all regarded as descendants of Cain, which is fascinating. So they are kind of human in a sense, but they're also demons in a way. And basically, that's another way that the poet is working in the traditional material into the Christian material. Is they can be understood by attaching them to something that is known and biblical. That fundamental first crime, that first murder, well, not first crime, but certainly the first murder, that is what spawns these sort of devilish beings like Grendel and his mother. And her onslaught was less only by as much as an Amazon warrior's strength is less than an armed man's, when the hefted sword, its hammered edge and gleaming blade slathered in blood, raises the sturdy boar ridge off a helmet. Again, notice that concrete sort of description of a thing. Then in the hall, hard-honed swords were grabbed from the bench, many a broad shield lifted and embraced. There was little thought of helmets or woven mail when they woke in terror. The hell dam was in panic, desperate to get out, in mortal terror the moment she was found. She had pounced and taken one of the retainers in a tight hold and headed for the fen. To Hrothgar, this man was the most beloved of the friends he trusted between the two seas. She had done away with a great warrior, ambushed him at rest. All right, so Beowulf was elsewhere. So now he has to go after her. Hrothgar has a wonderful sort of lament for his dead companion. Rest? What is rest? Sorrow has returned. Alas for the Danes. Eshra is dead. Okay, he was a soulmate to me, a true mentor, my right-hand man. when the ranks clashed. Okay, Escher was everything the world admires in a wise man and a friend. Okay, so they they come to find um, uh, and basic well, Beowulf's advice is also worth noting. He says, "Wise sir, do not grieve. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. For every one of us, living in this world means waiting for our end." That is kind of the Anglo-Saxon conception of things, at least the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon conception of things. There's a great mystery, again, to death. Let whoever can win glory before death. When a warrior is gone, that will be his best and only bulwark. And the poet does not comment on this. He just lets that worldview come out without commentary. So arise, my lord, and let us immediately set forth on the trail of this troll dam. I guarantee you she will not get away, not to dens underground, nor upland groves, nor the ocean floor. She'll have nowhere to flee to. Endure your troubles today. Bear up and be the man I expect you to be. Yeah, be man. Don't be a man about it. Yeah, these are tough. This is a tough era, a much different era. Now the way he has to deal with it is she's under the water, um, um, and he has to go after her. And here's when he knows he has to go dive in to go after her. Here's what he says: "Wisest of kings, now that I have come to the point of action, I ask you to recall what we said earlier. That you, son of Halfdane and gold friend to retainers, that you, if I should fall and suffer death while serving your cause, would act like a father to me afterwards. If this combat kills me, take care of my young company, my comrades in arms, and be sure also, my beloved Hrothgar, to send Higelac the treasures I received." Okay, so they gave him a bunch of treasure for defeating Grendel. He wants his father to receive that, or his lord to receive that. Um, and he's going to dive down. Oh, it's probably worth noting that Unferth, who insulted him earlier, gives him a weapon. So he gives him a good blade to try to help him out. When he lent that blade to the better swordsman, Unferth, the strong built son of Egloff, could hardly have remembered the ranting speech he had made in his cups. He was not man enough to face the turmoil of a fight underwater and the risk to his life. So there he lost fame and repute. It was different for the other, rigged out in his gear, ready to do battle. So Unferth is kind of a little coward, basically. But it does give him a blade to use. So he plunges down, and it's like magical, like it's like hours, like longer than any person could really hold his voice. But he goes down into the depths of the water, which I think is kind of appropriate. Uh, there's a kind of psychic reality to it, or mythic quality to it, that makes sense. Unferth's blade doesn't help him, but what happens is, uh, in her lair under the water, there is a weapon that he sees that was made for a giant, and he uses that to basically chop her head off. That's how he defeats Grendel's mother. The body gaped at the stroke dealt to it after death. Beowulf cut the corpse's head off. So he slices her in the neck and then chops her head off. And of course, the people up above see blood come up and they think that, oh, well, Beowulf's dead. So some of them go home. But his guys stay behind and wait for him. And the only thing, he also finds Grendel's body down there, and he brings up Grendel's head to demonstrate, yeah, so here's the head. And he describes what happened. And the blade melts when they melt the blood of Grendel's mother melts it, and he only has the hilt, and he shows it to Hrothgar, uh, which I think is also pretty cool. Um, and this, you know, they celebrate this. That's all fine. Um, it's just worth noting that there's a third battle that he has, The third one is with the fire dragon. And this comes much, much later. Um, he basically returns home. Higelac dies. Beowulf becomes the ruler, and he rules for 50 years. And fire dragon comes that he has to then deal with. Um, Dragon belch out flames and burn bright homesteads. There was a hot glow that scared everyone. The vile sky-winger would leave nothing alive in his wake. Everywhere the havoc he wrought was in evidence. Far and near, the Geat nation bore the brunt of his brutal assaults and virulent hate. Then back to his horde he would dart before daybreak to hide in his den. He'd swing the land, swathed it in fire and burning, and now he felt secure in the vaults of his barrow. But his trust was unavailing. Then Beowulf was given bad news, a hard truth. His own home, the best of buildings, had been burnt to a cinder, the throne room of the Geats. It threw the hero into deep anguish and darkened his mood. The wise man thought he must have thwarted ancient ordinance of the eternal Lord, broken his commandment. His mind was in turmoil, unaccustomed anxiety and gloom confused his brain. The fire dragon had raised the coastal region and reduced forts and earthworks to dust and ashes. So the war king planned and plotted his revenge. The warrior's protector, prince of the hall troop, ordered a marvelous all iron shield from his smithy works. He well knew that linden boards would let him down and timber burn. After many trials, he was destined to face the end of his days in this mortal world, as was the dragon for all his long leasehold on the treasure. Yet the Prince of the Rings was too proud to line up with a large army against the sky plague. He had scant regard for the dragon as a threat, no dread at all of its courage or strength, for he had kept going often in the past through perils and ordeals of every sort. After he had purged Hrothgar's hall, triumphed in Heorot, and beaten Grendel, he outgrappled the monster and his evil kin. All right, so he trusts in himself. He had survived many things, and he goes after the dragon. He is helped by Wiglaf, a retainer. Let's take a look at his last boast. Beowulf spoke, made a formal boast for the last time. I risked my life often when I was young. Now I am old. But as king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning. If the evil one will only abandon his earth fort and face me in the open. Then he dressed each dear companion one final time. Those fighters in their helmets, resolute and high-born. I would rather not use a weapon if I knew another way to grapple with the dragon and make good my boast, as I did against Grendel in days gone by. But I shall be meeting molten venom in the fire he breathes. So I go forth in mail shirt and shield. I won't shift a foot when I meet the cave guard. What occurs on the wall between the two of us will turn out as fate. Weird again. Overseer of men decides. I am resolved. I scorn further words against this skyborn foe. He tells them to remain there while he deals with it. He is unable to break through the scales with his sword. Um, was no easy thing. Um, but he is assisted by Wiglaf, who actually strikes a blow. Beowulf eventually kills him with a dagger, but he is mortally wounded. Now, yeah, once again, the king gathered his strength and drew a stabbing knife he carried on his belt, sharpened for battle. He struck it deep into the dragon's flank. Beowulf dealt it a deadly wound. They had killed the enemy, courage quelled his life. That pair of kinsmen, partners in nobility, had destroyed the foe. So every man should act, be at hand when needed. But now, for the king, this would be the last of his many labors and triumphs in the world. Okay, so this is great. Again, you see this idea of the weaving together. The Christian poet still says every man should act this way, right? even though the actions are noble and he praises them. But he is also aware of the end that must come to all of us. And Beowulf spoke in spite of his wounds, mortal wounds. He still spoke, for he well knew his days in the world had been lived out to the end. His allotted time was drawing to a close. Death was very near. And I think these last words are kind of touching. Now is the time when I would have wanted to bestow this armor on my own son. Had it been my fortune to have fathered an heir. Beowulf has no son and live on in his flesh. For 50 years I ruled this nation. No king of any neighboring clan would dare face me with troops. None had the power to intimidate me. I took what came, cared for, and stood by things in my keeping. Never fomented quarrels, never swore to a lie. All this consoles me, doomed as I am and sickening for death. Because of my right ways, the ruler of mankind need never blame me when the breath leaves my body for murder of kinsmen. Go now quickly, dearest Wiglaf, under the gray stone where the dragon is laid out, lost to his treasure. Hurry to feast your eyes on the hoard. Away you go. I want to examine that ancient gold, gaze my fill on those garnered jewels. My going will be easier for having seen the treasure, a less troubled letting go of the life and lordship I have long maintained. Now, why does he want to see it? Because it represents what he's leaving to his people. He killed the dragon and he gets the hoard, and the people should get the hoard, right? It's what he wants to leave to them. So remember that one of the signs of a great leader is you're a great giver. And basically, it's like, I gave my life for them and I won a great treasure for them. And that's an accomplishment. Then it's the last accomplishment that he can enjoy. Um, and here's how he says when he gazed sadly at the gold: To the everlasting Lord of all, to the King of glory, I give thanks that I behold this treasure here in front of me, that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die. Now that I have bartered my last breath to own this fortune, it is up to you to look after their needs. I can hold out no longer. Order my troop to construct a barrow on a headland on the coast. After my pyre has cooled, he's going to be burned. It will loom on the horizon at Crossness and be a reminder among my people, so that in coming times, crews under sail will call it Beowulf's Barrow as they steer ships across the wide and shrouded waves. And that's when he dies, basically. And Wiglaf he calls the last of us. That sort of melancholy sense of going away. And the poem doesn't end there because there's a lot more to describe what happens to the people and Beowulf's funeral. Um, but that's enough to get a sense of what this poem is all about and why it's kind of interesting to read. And that's kind of what you encounter in there. You encounter um, Anglo-Saxon culture and world sort of becoming in the process of becoming something closer to what we know of as the English culture, or at least the traditional English culture, such as it existed up to the 20th century. Now, that's an epic poem. Let's just take a little bit of a look at a lyric poem called The Seafarer, just to get a sense of what lyric poetry is about in Anglo-Saxon verse. Now, what's interesting about this one is this is just again, it's a lyric poem, so it's spoken in this one is spoken in the first person. I may ich be myself from Sofjed Reken. I can may I for myself make a true song and tell my travels. But the word is sekon, which means seek, the seeking. Tell of my seeking, how I often endured. Swink dayum. Swink is a word that means work. Swink day, work day, or days of struggle. Troublesome times, how I have suffered bitter breast cares, or here grim sorrows at the heart. I've known in the ship many worries, abodes of care, the terrible tossing of the waves, where the anxious night watch, nero nitwacho, often took me at the ship's prow when it tossed near the cliffs. Now I love this next bit. So I'll do the Old English and then the translation. Kalde gethrungen waren mein Fett, fettered by cold were my feet. Forste gebunden kaldem klommen, bound by frost and cold clasps. There the cheras gefunden, hot im horten. There the cares seethed, hot about my heart. Hunger in onslaught merwerges mod. Hunger tore from within my sea-weary soul. So basically describing seafaring as a bitter and hard life. And he says that man does not know the kind of man who on land lives on land and things turn out favorably. He doesn't know how I, wretched and sorrowful, on the ice cold sea, dwelt for a winter in the paths of exile, bereft of friendly kinsmen. Behongen primicellum, hung with icicles. Hail flew in showers. There I heard nothing but the roaring sea, the ice cold wave. At times, the swan song I took to myself as pleasure, the gannet's noise and the voice of the curlew instead of the laughter of men, the singing of gull instead of the drinking of mead. Now, so rough time, right? Rough times. Um, and indeed, he credits it little the one who has the joys of life, dwells in the city, far from terrible journey, proud and wanton with wine. How I, weary, oft have had to endure in the sea paths. The shadows of night darkened, it snowed from the north, frost bound the earth, hail fell on the earth, the coldest of grains. Indeed, now they are troubled, the thoughts of my heart, that I myself should strive with the high streams, the tossing of salt waves. The wish of my heart urges all the time my spirit to go forth, that I, far from here, should seek the homeland of a foreign people. Now, this is part of why this is kind of fascinating poem. So interesting that in the 20th century, the poet Ezra Pound did a translation of it to sort of demonstrate that even an ancient poem like this has qualities which can make it sound and feel modern. And in his own way, he demonstrated that. And basically, what this poet is saying is that what's interesting about it is that hard as it is, there's something in his spirit that drives him to seek this. He wants to fare out on the sea. The life on land is not for him. And you can see, and you can see here, um, where okay, so he says basically, there's no man so proud spirited who has such generous gifts given to him, so bold in his youth, so brave in his deeds, so dear to his Lord, that he never in his seafaring has a worry. Like no matter who you are, you have concern in seafaring that you're going to die as to what his Lord will do to him. But for those who go seafaring, not for him is the sound of the harp, nor the giving of rings, nor pleasure in woman, nor worldly glory, nor anything at all, unless the tossing of waves. But he always has a longing, he who strives on the waves. Now, I think there's an interesting uh, thing I learned once where the ancients, and I think we would include the Anglo-Saxon among the ancients here, had two different conceptions of death. There's the death of the body, but there's another death, which is a social death, meaning your death to the world of society, social opinion, what others believe or do or think. And part of properly understanding Christian take on things is to understand that a lot of times in New Testament and in the writing of the church fathers, when they talk about death or preparing for death, and not just Christianity, but also in Plato, when Socrates says that the philosopher's business is preparing for death, it's not just the death of the body that they mean. It's also this social death, meaning that If you're a philosopher or if you're a believer in Christ, you die to the world of what other men think, because on some level that's nothing. Okay, that because the truth is that's not the truth. It just isn't. Um, and this poem is offering that in a way. It's offering an interesting take because basically what it's saying is, yeah, it's much better on land, but there are people who, nice as it is, they have that desire for seafaring, right? Their souls are not content with it. And let's look at how he goes on to say about it. He has yeah, there's always that longing. He who strives on the waves. Um, let's skip down. This the man does not know, the warrior lucky in worldly things. What some endure then, that is, on the sea, those who tread most widely the paths of exile. And now my spirit twists out of my breast, my spirit out on the waterways, over the whale's path. It soars widely through all the corners of the world. It comes back to me eager and unsated. The lone flyer screams, urges onto the whale road the unresisting heart across the waves of the sea. Indeed, hotter for me are the joys of the Lord than this dead life fleeting on the land. I do not believe that the riches of the world will stand forever. Always and invariably, one of three things will turn to uncertainty before his fated hour: disease, or old age, or the sword's hatred will tear out the life from those doomed to die. And so it is for each man the praise of the living, of those who speak afterwards. That is the best epitaph that he should work before he must be gone. Bravery in the world against the enmity of devils, daring deeds against the fiend, so that the sons of men will praise him afterwards, and his fame afterwards will live with the angels forever and ever. The glory of eternal life, joy with the hosts. So even here, there's a kind of weaving together of the traditional view of things. Yeah, the winning of glory, but here it's the winning of glory by fighting against God's enemies. Another quality that you find in Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon mind, is this sense of living in a faded and worse world. They're aware of things. They're aware, sort of even of the Roman Empire, if you will. The days are gone of all the glory of the kingdoms of the earth. There are not now kings nor Caesars, and he does use Caesaras, nor givers of gold as once there were, when they, the greatest among themselves, performed valorous deeds, and with a most lordly majesty lived. All that old guard is gone, and the revels are over. The weaker ones now dwell and hold the world, enjoy it through their sweat. The glory is fled. The nobility of the world ages and grows sere, as now does every man throughout the world. All right. And basically that that aging of things is likened to the aging of a man. And as you age, you begin to think of your eternal fate. Let us ponder where we have our homes, and then think how we should get thither. And then we should all strive that we might go there to the eternal blessedness, that is a belonging life, in the love of the Lord, joy in the heavens. Let there be thanks to God that he adored us, the Father of glory, the eternal Lord, Eche Drichten, which is a phrase that was used in Kedman's hymn, and you can see that it has caught on and been repeated here for all time in Alatida. Amen. So that's a real good sense of what Anglo-Saxon poetry is kind of all about. This has gone on a little bit longer than I intended, but we had a lot to get through. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. And I hope that um, whether you're watching this live or listening to it later, I hope that you'll tune in next time for the next poetry stream. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time.